It was a cold and silent night, and the wind was moving slowly through the trees, and the sky was dark without any stars, and everything around the farmhouse was quiet, like the world had stopped breathing for a while. He was sitting on his wooden chair, holding a warm cup of tea and looking outside through the window and thinking about how quiet this night was and how peaceful it felt. But suddenly a sound came from the garden, like someone had stepped on dry leaves, and he stood up quickly and stared into the dark with surprise in his eyes, and his heart started beating a little faster because he lived alone, and no one ever came this far from the town. He opened the door slowly and picked up the flashlight that was hanging near the door, and he stepped outside into the cold night air, and the grass was wet, and the wind touched his face like a whisper, and he moved carefully toward the sound and kept looking left and right with the light shaking in his hand. As he reached the middle of the garden, he saw something on the ground, something that did not belong there, something that looked like a person, and he walked closer with fear in his heart, and the light in his hand revealed a woman lying on the ground with a small child in her arms, and her face looked pale, and her clothes were torn and dirty, and there was blood on her forehead. She opened her eyes for a second and looked at him with fear and hope mixed together, and she reached out her shaking hand and held his wrist, and her lips moved slowly as if it took great effort to speak, and she whispered in a weak voice, "Please don't let them take her." And then her hand fell and her eyes closed again, and she fainted. Without another word, he stood frozen for a moment and then looked down at the child, who was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and her eyes were wide open, but she did not cry and she did not speak, and she only looked at him like she knew something terrible was going to happen. And he bent down and gently picked both of them up and carried them inside his house. He laid the woman on his old wooden bed and wrapped her in a blanket, and he placed the child in a chair close by and gave her some water, but she did not drink it, and she only kept staring at the ceiling, and her eyes had no tears and no fear, just silence. And he felt something strange in his chest, like he had become part of something bigger and something dangerous. He looked at the woman again, and she was breathing, but slowly, and her face looked peaceful now, but he could not forget her words, "Please don't let them take her." And he kept thinking, who are they, and why do they want the child? And where did this woman come from? He checked the pockets of her coat and found nothing, but when he looked inside her small bag, he found a strange object, something that looked like a device with soft blue lights on it and strange symbols that moved like they were alive, and he had never seen anything like it in his life. He touched the device, and it blinked once and then again, and then made a small sound like a soft alarm, and a voice came from it, a voice that was not human, and it said, "Tracking signal activated," and then it went silent and the lights turned red. His eyes went wide, and he dropped the device on the table and stepped back and looked at the door, as if something was about to enter, and he felt cold, even though the fire was burning in the fireplace, and the child was still sitting still and quiet and looking straight at him now, like she knew that he had heard the message. He went to the window and moved the curtain and looked outside into the night and saw nothing but dark trees and the moon behind the clouds, and then something moved in the sky, something big and slow and silent, like a shadow with wings, and it passed above his house without a sound. He stood there without blinking, and his mind was screaming, but his mouth said nothing, and the voice of the woman kept repeating in his head, "Please don't let them take her." And now he knew that someone or something was coming, and it was not human, and it was already close. The night was heavy with silence, and only the sound of the wind touched the wooden walls of the small farmhouse as he sat near the woman, watching her breathe slowly and carefully, while the child sat on the chair, not moving, not speaking, just looking down at her tiny fingers that were holding a strange small stone that glowed softly like it was alive. He wanted to ask questions, but there were no answers, and the only voice in the room was the one inside his head repeating the words she said before she fainted, "Please don't let them take her." And he kept thinking, who are they, and why is she afraid, and where did she come from, and why did she choose my garden of all places in this wide, lonely land? He walked to the kitchen and poured some water into a glass and offered it to the child again, but she did not take it and did not look at him, and her eyes were still fixed on the stone as if it was showing her something he could not see. And he felt that this child was different, not in a strange way, but in a way that made his heart feel heavy with something he could not name. The Device on the table was still blinking with a red light, and its surface was warm to the touch, and he wanted to throw it away, but something told him not to. And his fingers hovered over it like they were waiting for permission, and he sat down and looked at the woman again. Her face was calm but pale, and her body was shaking a little under the blanket. Suddenly, her eyes opened again, and she gasped like she was waking from a nightmare, and she sat up quickly and held her head with both hands and looked around the room, and when her eyes saw the child, her body relaxed a little, and then she looked at him and said, "Where is it, the device? You touched it. Did it say anything?" And he nodded slowly and told her it said tracking signal activated. She closed her eyes and whispered no under her breath and said, "They are coming. We have to move." But she looked too weak to stand, and he asked, "Who is coming and what do they want?" And she looked straight into his eyes and said, "You have no idea what you have become a part of, and you should walk away now, but it is already too late because they know you too." She told him her name was Lyra, and that she was not from this part of the world and not from any country he could name, and her words made no sense at first, but her eyes told the truth. They held stories older than time and pain deeper than the sea. And she said, "The child is my daughter, and they want her because she is special in a way even I do not fully understand." Lyra said they came from above, not from the stars, but from the space between stars, a place humans cannot see or reach, and they made a deal with some men from Earth many years ago, and in return for power and knowledge, they were allowed to take certain children who had something in their minds, something bright and different, and her daughter was one of them. She had escaped from a place where they kept her and others like her in cold, white rooms, and did tests every day and made them use their minds in strange ways, and the things they saw were not meant for young eyes. And her daughter survived because she stopped speaking and stopped reacting, and they thought she was broken, but she was only hiding, waiting for her moment. He listened and wanted to believe it was all a lie, but deep inside he knew it was not, and he remembered the strange lights in the sky 3 nights ago and the way his animals had been acting strange since then, and now he knew it was all connected, and this woman was telling the truth. The child suddenly looked up at him, and her lips moved, and she said in a soft, quiet voice, "They are near," and her words felt like a cold hand on his back, and he rushed to the window and looked outside and saw nothing at first, but then he noticed the wind had stopped, and the trees were no longer moving, and even the sound of insects had vanished. The sky looked the same, but something was different, and he could feel it in his bones, like a silence that was not natural, and he saw a flicker of something in the sky, a shimmer like heat above a fire, and it moved in a circle above the trees as if searching. He turned back and said, "We have to go now," but Lyra said, "We cannot leave yet, not while the signal is active, and we need to disable it or they will follow wherever we go." And she reached for the device and opened a small panel and pressed something inside, and the blinking stopped and the light turned green. The house suddenly felt colder, and the child stood up from the chair and walked to the window and pointed to the sky, and he followed her finger and saw it, a shape hiding in the clouds, not a plane, not a bird, but something else, something not meant for this world, and it was watching the air around the house. Felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down from above, and the man stood still near the window trying to understand what he was seeing as the strange shape in the sky slowly disappeared into the clouds, and the silence outside felt deeper than before, like even the night itself was afraid to make a sound. Lyra sat weakly on the edge of the bed, breathing hard, while her fingers moved over the small device in her lap, and her eyes never left the child, who now stood quietly near the door, staring at the wooden floor as if waiting for something to happen. And the green light on the device was steady and calm, but her voice was not. When she finally spoke and said, "They know where we are now, and they will not stop until they take her or destroy everything around her." The man asked again, "Who are they, and why do they want her, and what is this deal you keep talking about?" And Lyra looked at him like a teacher who must tell a student a truth too big for their young mind, and she said, "They are not from the stars you see, but from the space that lies between the stars, the dark, cold space where light dies and sound cannot live. And they are older than your sun and smarter than your machines, and they are called the Sky Watchers because they never sleep and they are always looking." She told him that long ago, some people in secret places made contact with them through signals and machines, and promises were made and lies were shared, and slowly, Quietly, without anyone noticing, some doors were opened between our world and theirs, and children with minds too bright for normal life were taken in the name of science, in the name of peace, in the name of control. She said her daughter was born with a light in her that cannot be copied or studied or broken, and the sky watchers wanted that light because it is something even they do not have and cannot understand. And when they took her, Lyra followed, and when she found her, she ran, and when they chased her, she hid, and when she could not hide any more, she collapsed in the only place that felt safe, even though she had never been here before. The man asked, "Why here? Why my garden?" And Lyra said, "Because her daughter felt something here. A silence that was not empty, a place that was not watching, a piece of earth where the watchers could not see clearly, and that small piece of peace was enough for her to fall and hope." The child finally looked up and walked to her mother and touched her hand and said, "They are trying to listen again." And Lyra nodded and said, "Then we must move soon before they send something worse than a ship, something small and quiet, something that walks on two legs and speaks with a smile." The man stepped outside and looked around with a flashlight in hand and saw nothing but trees and shadows, but still his heart felt something was close, something hiding just beyond sight. And when he returned to the house, the device started making a low sound like a whisper that grew louder with each second, and Lyra stood up with effort and said, "It means something has landed nearby." The child closed her eyes and began humming a soft tune, and the sound from the device stopped as if silenced by her song, and the man looked at her and then at Lyra and said, "What did she do?" And Lyra said, "She is learning to block them, to bend their signals, to twist the rules they made." There was a knock on the door. It was soft and polite, like a neighbor asking for sugar, and the man froze, and Lyra held the child close and shook her head and whispered, "Do not answer." And the knock came again, and a voice followed it, a calm, friendly voice saying, "I'm from the local power company, and we detected a surge in your area, just checking if everything is all right, sir." The man looked at Lyra, who whispered, "They use faces and voices. They take memories from your machines and radios and build masks. Do not open, do not speak." And the child held the strange glowing stone in her hand again and said, "It is not a man, it is a whisper in skin." The man backed away from the door, and the knock stopped, and the silence returned, and then a shape moved past the window, a tall, thin shape with eyes that glowed for a moment like metal under sunlight, and then vanished into the dark, and the flashlight flickered and died. Lyra said, "It is one of their messengers. They come first to look, to listen, to judge if the area is weak or strong, and now they know we are trying to resist, and they will come with more." The man asked, "What do we do now?" And Lyra looked down at the child, who now stared out the window with eyes glowing faintly like the stone in her hand, and said, "Now we prepare to run again, but this time we must go underground." The night had not ended, but it felt longer than any night he had ever lived, and the silence outside was no longer peaceful but heavy like a warning, and inside the house everything had changed, though the walls and furniture were the same, and the air held a weight that pressed against his chest like unseen hands. Lyra sat near the window with her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around her daughter and her eyes watching the door as if it would breathe and move and speak, and she looked tired, not from running but from remembering. And the man sat near the fireplace trying to keep the flames alive with dry wood and quiet hope. The child was still holding the strange stone, and now it pulsed with a slow, soft rhythm like a heartbeat, and she stared into the fire without blinking, and her mind seemed far away, like it was listening to something no one else could hear. He finally broke the silence with a whisper that did not rise above the crackle of fire, and asked, "Who are you really? And why does your child glow like that? And why do these watchers care so much?" Lyra turned her face slowly, and her eyes looked deeper than before, and her voice came out soft and full of old pain as she said, "I was not born here, not on this earth. Not on any map, you know, and I was brought here when I was very young and raised as human, taught as human, loved as human, but I never was, and they knew it, and they watched me grow, waiting for what I would become." She looked at the child and continued her story with a voice that held both pride and fear, and said, "She is not just mine, she is not just from me. She is the result of something rare and impossible, something they were not ready for, and something they now fear because she can change what they built." The man asked, "Change how?" And she said, "Her mind works in layers, like music, like light, like time, and she sees Not just what is, but also what could be and what has been, and she can hear signals without machines and break patterns. Without codes, and this is why they called her the Echo, because she remembers everything, even what she never saw. She said the facility where they kept us was under the ground, covered by silence and metal and guarded by machines that do not sleep. And they used wires in cold rooms and fake voices to test us, to break us, to turn us into keys for doors we could never see, and many did not survive, because they tried to fight with anger. But my daughter, she stayed silent. She listened, she learned. He listened without speaking because he knew words would not carry the weight of her story, and his eyes kept moving to the child, who now closed her eyes slowly and held the stone tighter as if feeling danger coming near like a wave. Lyra said, "They do not fear weapons, they fear awareness," and she is the first one who slipped past their net, not because she ran fast, but because she walked slowly and left no sound. And when I found her, I saw what she had become, and I knew we had to leave before she reached the point where they could no longer follow, because then they would destroy everything around her. She stood up slowly, and the child stood with her, and she walked to the small window and pointed to the sky and said, "They built a machine above us, not a ship, not a station, but something in between, something that listens to thoughts and dreams and watches, not just the ground, but the mind." And when her signal reached them, they thought she was a mistake, a glitch in the code. The man felt cold all over and asked why not go to the government or the army or someone with power. And Lyra looked at him with sad eyes and said, "The ones who should protect us are the ones who made the deal. They gave away the future for the illusion of safety, and now they serve silence instead of truth." The child spoke again, her voice clear and light, and said, "They are trying to open a door again, but it is not ready, and if they open it too soon, it will break and everything will fall through." And the man did not understand what she meant, but Lyra did, and her face turned pale as she said, "They are rushing. They are afraid she will reach the next stage, and once that happens, they cannot unsee her." He walked to the door and locked it again, and looked around the room and asked, "What is the next stage?" And Lyra said, "It is not something I can explain. It is something you feel, like the sun rising for the first time, or the sea learning to breathe, and once she steps into it, the watchers will no longer be watchers, they will become runners, and that is why we cannot stay here any longer." The flames in the fireplace flickered, and the shadows on the wall danced like warnings, and far away outside something made a sound, not like footsteps, but like something trying to remember how to walk. And the child looked toward the sound and said, "It is near." The wind outside had gone still again, and the trees stood without a sound, like they were holding their breath. And the man stood at the door with his hand resting on the old wood, feeling the strange tension in the air, like the house was surrounded by something it could not see, but still knew inside the room. The child had moved away from the fire and now sat cross-legged in the corner with her eyes closed and her hands on her knees, and the glowing stone resting on the floor before her, and it pulsed like a tiny heart, beating out a rhythm that felt alive and ancient and deep. Lyra walked slowly to the man and said, "We cannot wait for morning, we must leave before the sky opens again, and the watchers send what they call a seeker, and once a seeker steps inside, no walls, no locks, no prayers can hide you." As she placed her hand on his shoulder and looked into his eyes and asked, "Are you ready to stop being a stranger in this story?" He did not answer with words, but turned to grab the small bag by the fireplace and filled it with food and water and a map he had not used in years and a metal torch, and then walked over to the table and took the device that once blinked red and now sat quiet and still, and placed it in the bag. Without asking why, Lyra picked up the child gently, and the girl opened her eyes and whispered, "We have little time." And the man looked outside again through the crack in the wooden wall and thought he saw a flicker of movement, like a shadow moving faster than light, and he stepped back and nodded and said, "Then we leave now." They exited the house quietly with slow, careful steps, and behind them the fire still burned, and the house that had stood for so many years now felt like a place that no longer belonged to this world. And the ground was soft with dew, and the stars were hidden behind low clouds, and the only light came from the small stone still pulsing softly in the child's hand. Lyra led the way through the trees, moving like someone who knew each branch and root, and the man followed with eyes scanning every dark shape, every flicker of wind, every sudden silence, and the child was Between them quiet and calm like a candle that refused to flicker even when the storm was near after a long walk. They reached a place he had not visited in a long time, a hollow behind a wall of stone covered with moss and vines, and when Lyra touched a certain spot, the ground shook lightly and a small door opened and the smell of earth and metal came out. Like a memory waking up, they stepped inside and the door closed behind them, and now they were inside an old tunnel forgotten by time. A place once used by soldiers many years ago and now filled with dust and wires and echoes, and the sound of their footsteps was the only thing that moved as they walked deeper. The air grew colder and Lyra said, "This place is not on any map because it was erased by those who built it and used only by those who knew what they were hiding from, and it is not safe forever, but it will give us enough time to breathe and prepare." They reached a chamber with metal walls and old lights that flickered when the child stepped near, and Lyra placed her on a table and said, "Rest now," and to the man she said, "Watch the far tunnel for signs," and she walked to a rusted cabinet and opened it and pulled out an old device that looked like a radio and began to turn its dials slowly. The child lay still and closed her eyes again, and the glowing stone floated just above her chest now without touching her skin, and it spun slowly like it was drawing in power from the air itself, and the man watched with wide eyes and asked, "What is happening to her?" Lyra said, "She is reaching the gate, not a place but a state of being. And once she crosses it, her presence will change, and the watchers will feel it like a storm passing through their minds. And they will send the collector not to take, but to erase, and that is why we must block the signal completely now or never suddenly." From the far end of the tunnel came a soft hum like electricity waking up, and the man grabbed his torch and walked slowly toward the sound, and the beam of light showed nothing at first, just metal and stone and dust, but then he saw something lying on the floor, a small drone with legs like an insect and a camera eye that blinked once before burning out. He returned and showed it to Lyra, and she said, "The seeker is near." This was just the eye. Now the hand will follow, and then the mouth, and the child opened her eyes and said, "It is already listening from behind the wall." The stone above her chest turned blue, and the walls of the chamber shook, and the old lights turned red, and the man said, "What do we do?" And Lyra said, "We run, but this time we do not run alone," and she placed her hand on the stone, and the chamber door opened. The tunnel opened into a new space, a deeper chamber made of black stone and metal walls that hummed with silent energy, and the air was colder here like it had not been touched by the sun in 100 years, and as they stepped inside, the man felt the pressure change like they had entered a place that should never have been made. Child walked slowly, now her eyes glowing faintly and her small feet moving like she knew this place without ever being here before, and Lyra followed close behind her eyes, watching every corner, every crack in the walls like she expected something to rise from the shadows, and the man walked last, holding the torch tight in one hand and the bag in the other, and his heart beating fast without rhythm. "This place is older than the house, older than the war, older than the machines," Lyra said, her voice quiet like a secret being shared with the earth, and she pointed to the walls where strange carvings marked the metal shapes like eyes and hands and stars, and the man asked, "Who made this?" And she said, "Those who first saw the sky watchers, those who tried to hide from them under the ground when the sky was no longer safe." The child stopped in the center of the chamber and placed the glowing stone on the floor, and it began to spin and hover and cast long blue light across the room, and the carvings on the walls began to move like shadows coming to life, and the metal pulsed like a slow heart waking from sleep, and the chamber was no longer dark but filled with a strange, gentle light. The man stepped back and stared and said, "What is this place?" And Lyra said, "This is where they kept the first echoes, the first children like her, the ones who could hear more than sound and see more than light and think beyond the shape of time, and they were not tested here. They were studied and protected, and when the watchers found this place, they tried to erase it, but something resisted, and so they sealed it and left it silent." He moved toward one of the old consoles and touched it, and a screen came to life, showing flickers of faces, not people, but children, wide-eyed and bright with wonder and fear, and next to each face were symbols he could not read and numbers that changed on their own, and he asked what happened to them, and Lyra looked down and said, "Some escaped, some were taken, and some became something else, and now this place remembers them even. If the world does not, the child spoke again and said, they are near, the collector is above. Us, it is not alone. And the man looked up as if he could see through the rock and the sky and asked, what is a collector? And Lyra said, it is not a machine. And not a being, it is something that removes what should not exist. It does not kill, it deletes. And if it finds her, it will take her from every memory, from every file, from every mind, and only this place will remember she was ever real. He asked, how do we stop something like that? And Lyra said, we cannot stop it. We must blind it and confuse it and make it believe she is already gone, and the stone is the key, and the signal must be changed before the light above finds her again. The child reached out and touched the console, and the screen turned white, then black, then filled with strange shapes and colors, and the light in the room turned purple. And Lyra said, she is rewriting the path. She is making a new pattern they cannot follow. And if she finishes it, they will look and not find her. They will reach and feel nothing. Ground shook gently, and a loud sound came from above, like a great breath being taken, and the air in the chamber grew warmer and heavier, and the man felt something press against his chest, and his hands began to sweat, and he said, they are here. And Lyra said, no, not yet, but soon, and we must protect the signal until it is done, or she will be lost. They heard a loud crack, and dust fell from the ceiling. And the man raised his torch and saw the far wall shift, like something was pushing from the other side, and the child kept working her eyes, closed her hands, moving in the air like drawing symbols, and the stone glowing brighter than ever, and the screen now showing lines that curved like waves from the broken wall, came a shape tall and thin and not human, with long arms and a head like glass, and it stepped into the chamber without sound and raised its hand toward the child, and the air grew thick like water, and the man shouted and ran between them, holding up the bag and the device. Inside began to blink red again. Lyra moved beside him and placed her hand on the device and whispered something in a language not from Earth, and the light inside the stone split into three and covered the child in a shell of light, and the tall shape paused and lowered its hand and tilted its head and took one slow step back. The child opened her eyes, and the console went dark, and the stone dropped to the floor, no longer glowing, and she said, it is done. They will not find me now. And the shape turned and walked back through the broken wall, as if it had never come in. The chamber became quiet again. The chamber was silent now, and the air had changed, like the room had breathed, and now waited for something more. And the child stood in the center, still and calm, with her arms by her side, and the stone at her feet no longer glowing, and the metal walls no longer humming, and even the lights had faded back into shadow. The man looked around, unsure if the danger was truly gone or simply hiding again, and Lyra moved slowly to the child and knelt beside her and placed a hand on her back and said, you did it. And the girl nodded once and looked toward the tunnel they had come from and said, the sky is not safe, but the ground is broken too, and now we must climb higher than both. The man asked, climb where? And Lyra looked at him and said, there is one last place, one last step, and if she takes it, they will never be able to touch her again. But if she does not, the Watchers will return, and they will bring the end of silence with them. And he said, then we go wherever we must. And Lyra said, not. We only heard they left the chamber with slow steps, and the path ahead was narrow and winding, and old wires hung from the ceiling like roots, and the dust rose in small clouds under their feet. And the child walked first without fear, and the others followed in silence, like people walking beside a storm after a long climb. They reached a door of smooth white stone with no handle and no frame, and the child placed her hand on it, and the surface rippled like water and slowly opened to a place filled with wind and light and sky. They stood on the edge of a high cliff surrounded by mountains that touched the clouds, and valleys lost in fog, and the wind was strong and wild, and the air smelled clean like rain before it falls. And the man stepped forward and looked around and said, where are we? And Lyra said, we are above the reach of the Watchers and below the eyes of the world, and this place was made for one purpose only. She looked at the child and said, this is where it ends or begins? And the girl nodded and stepped forward to the edge, and the wind wrapped around her like it knew her name, and the clouds moved away from the peak, like they were making space. The man turned to Lyra and asked, what happens now? And Lyra said, now she decides if she wants to rise or return, and no one can make that choice for her, not me, not you, not even them. And the child stood with her eyes closed and the stone in her hand, Once more, and the air around her shimmered like heat and light. And memory a sound came from above, not loud, but deep like a bell ringing through the sky, and a shape appeared in the clouds, long and silver, and floating with no wings and no fire. And it moved slowly like it was afraid to come closer, and then it stopped and waited without a word, without a beam, without a threat. Child opened her eyes and looked at it, and then at the man, and then at Lyra, and said, I hear them still. They are afraid and not angry, and they are waiting because they do not understand what I have become, and they want to know if I will rise or hide thee. Wind picked up, and the light grew brighter, and the child began to glow again, not like before, but in waves of soft color blue, then gold, then silver, and her feet lifted slightly from the stone, and her hair moved like it was under water, and her voice came like a song with no sound, and the shape in the sky trembled and began to fade. Lyra stepped back, and the man watched without speaking as the girl rose higher, and the stone in her hand cracked and turned to dust, and the wind wrapped around her like wings, made of sky and memory and time. And then she looked down and spoke her last words to them. She said, I choose the path where they cannot follow, and the path where I do not hide, and if they return I will be more than they can see and more than they can hold. And the man felt something shift inside him like hope, waking from a long sleep. Then the light burst around her, and the sky opened, and the wind screamed not in fear but in joy, and the girl vanished into the clouds, and the shape in the sky turned and moved away, and the sun broke through the clouds, and the cliff became quiet again. Lyra fell to her knees and cried without sound, and the man stood beside her, not as a farmer, not as a stranger, but as someone who had seen a miracle and now understood that the world would never be the same. And he looked at the sky and whispered, she was not just a child, she was the choice the watchers could never make. In far above the clouds, where light has no shadow and time has no weight, something new was born, and it had her voice, and it had her light, and it watched not like the watchers, but like a guardian who remembers.